When you hear the word Titanic, what's the first thing you think of? An iceberg, right? Of course. But the real story, the full story, is so much bigger than that. It's a powerful lesson about overconfidence, hidden dangers, and some really tragic mistakes. So, let's dive in.
The real question isn't just what hit the Titanic, it's why. I mean, how does a ship that was advertised as the peak of modern technology, a ship they called unsinkable, end up at the bottom of the ocean on its very first trip? In less than 3 hours? How does that happen?
Well, the truth is, the iceberg wasn't really the cause. It was more like the final domino to fall. The disaster was what you'd call a cascade failure, basically a perfect storm created by 3 huge interlocking problems. First, an attitude of complete overconfidence. Second, some critical hidden flaws in the ship itself. And third, a social system that literally decided who would get a chance to live and who would be left to die.
All right, so let's start with that mindset. Because honestly, the biggest danger to the Titanic wasn't a chunk of ice. It was an idea. It was the belief that humans had finally built something so incredible, so advanced, that they had actually conquered the ocean.
I mean, just listen to this. This is a quote from the ship's actual captain, Edward Smith, a few years before the voyage. Now, that isn't just him puffing out his chest for the cameras. He genuinely believed it. Everybody did. They thought technology had made them invincible. And that confidence, it would have absolutely devastating consequences.
And you know, Captain Smith wasn't some kind of outlier. This was the whole industry. It was just standard practice to steam ahead at high speed, even through areas where they knew there were icebergs. They just figured the lookouts would spot any danger in time to turn. They were sailing the ship like nothing could possibly touch it. And that was the first and biggest mistake.
So when you think you're unsinkable, what happens? You start to get complacent. On the day of the disaster, the Titanic received at least 6 different ice warnings. But just look at what happened to the last 2, the most important ones. A message warning of heavy pack ice directly in your path. It never even made it to the captain. And then less than an hour before the collision, another ship basically radioed to say, hey, we're stopped because we're completely surrounded by ice.
And this was the reply from the Titanic's senior wireless operator. "Shut up! I am busy." He was trying to send a backlog of personal messages for the passengers. And that one single angry response, it tells you everything you need to know about the ship's broken communication system.
You see, here's the thing you have to understand. The radio operators didn't actually work for the Titanic shipping line. They worked for a different company, the Marconi Company. And their primary job, the one they got paid for, was sending telegrams for rich passengers. It was a cool new luxury service. So vital safety warnings had to compete with birthday wishes and stock tips. And on that night, luxury won. So that unsinkable attitude wasn't just in the crew's heads, it was actually built right into the steel of the ship itself. The Titanic had critical weaknesses that, well, nobody saw coming until it was way too late.
Okay, so you've probably seen it in the movies, right? The iceberg tears this huge 300-foot gash in the side of the ship. Well, that's not actually what happened. The iceberg didn't slice the ship open. Instead, the force of the impact basically buckled the steel plates and popped the rivets holding them together. It essentially unzipped the seams of the ship.
And why would it do that? Well, it comes down to basic science. In that nearly freezing water, the ship's steel and, this is really important, the lower quality iron rivets they used on the front of the ship became incredibly brittle. So instead of bending or denting on impact like you'd expect, they just shattered, like glass. The intense cold itself turned the ship's armor into its biggest weakness.
Now, the ship's main defense was its famous watertight compartments. The thinking was it could stay afloat even if 4 of these compartments flooded, but the iceberg damaged 6, and that exposed the single greatest design flaw on the entire ship. The watertight walls didn't go all the way to the ceiling. So as the front of the ship sank down, water just started spilling over the top of one wall and into the next compartment, and then the next, and the next. It was exactly like tipping an ice cube tray. That unsinkable design guaranteed that it would sink.
So the big question is, why? Why on earth would they build it that way? It wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. The walls were kept low on purpose so that they could have those huge, grand, open spaces for the first-class passengers, like the famous Grand Staircase. The ship's safety was literally sacrificed for luxury.
And this brings us to the third, and maybe the most tragic part of the story. Because as the ship was going down, that same class system that shaped its design would now decide who got a chance to survive.
About 1,500 people died that night. But a person's chance of being one of them depended almost completely on the price of the ticket they were holding.
The numbers here, they tell a really shocking story. If you were in first class, you had a better than 60% chance of making out alive. In second class, that dropped to 42%. And if you were down in third class, your chance of survival was less than 1 in 4. It wasn't random. It was a privilege.
We all know that famous phrase, women and children first. But the data shows the real, unwritten rule was more like first class first. A child in third class actually had a lower chance of surviving than a man traveling in first class. Just think about that for a second.
So why was it like this? Well, the official investigation later claimed that third-class passengers weren't deliberately held back, but that's not what the survivors said. One survivor, Anna Targia, remembered a crew member letting her small group through a gate and then locking and chaining it behind them, trapping dozens of others down below. Between physical gates, language barriers, and just no one telling them where to go, many were doomed.
But the biggest reason so many people died was painfully simple. There just weren't enough lifeboats. And here's the truly crazy part. The Titanic actually had more lifeboats than the law required at the time. The problem was the law itself was completely out of date. It based the number of lifeboats on a ship's weight, not how many people were on board. The law basically assumed that a huge modern ship was its own lifeboat.
The sinking of the Titanic was a horrifying tragedy, but it was also a preventable one. Its loss was a brutal wake-up call that shattered the world's faith in technology, and it led directly to the international safety laws that still protect people at sea today.
Just 2 years later, the first SOLAS Convention, that's for Safety of Life at Sea, was held. And it was basically a point-by-point fix for everything that went wrong. The lifeboat problem? Fixed. Now they're based on people, not tonnage. The ignored radio calls? Fixed. A 24-hour radio watch is now mandatory. They even created an international ice patrol. Every single new rule was a lesson written in tragedy.
So in the end, you see, the Titanic wasn't really sunk by an iceberg. It was sunk by a deadly mix of human pride, bad design, and deep inequality. The iceberg didn't cause the disaster, it just exposed all the fatal flaws that were already there, waiting. And that leaves us with a pretty heavy question, one that's just as relevant today. The story of the Titanic isn't just about a ship that sank a long time ago. It's a powerful warning about how easily our own confidence can lead us straight into disaster. And it makes you wonder, what icebergs might we be sailing towards right now?